Um, Brilliant. Dr. Golooba-Mutebi, welcome to Rwanda Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you, Vincent.
I should actually say welcome back to Rwanda Beyond the Headlines.
Indeed, I was just going to say it's good to be back.
Yes, it's a real launch. It's been a long hiatus, but we're back, and this time we actually get to be seen. That may or may not be a good thing, but there we are. So I want to look at obviously Kwibuka 30. And that remembrance after the 30 years 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. You're a political scientist, and you're very familiar with Rwanda. You've done an awful lot of work on Rwanda as a researcher, both politically and also socially.
Yeah.
So you know the country well.
Yeah, reasonably well, I would say.
Right. Yeah. So I want to put something to you as we begin this, in that 30 years ago, the genocidal clique, I won't even call it a government really, because it seems to me that government presupposes some sort of governance. It was a triumph of the colonial powers. So they wanted something, and they created it, and that was it. That was the creature that they had created. So I'm suggesting that independence for Rwanda does not come in 1962 as is written on the books. It actually comes at Kwibohora, which is liberation after the defeat of the genocidal establishment in 1994, July 1994. So that's how I'm looking at it, because essentially it makes very little difference if you agree that the pre-94 clique, or government, let's call it government for the purposes of clarity, was very much a creature of the colonial establishment, of the colonial powers. Belgium at the time, of course, but later on the French, as you know, then the idea of independence makes no sense. So independence comes after 1994.
Yeah. Perhaps before I go there, in your introduction you said I've done a great deal of research here, which is true. But actually I think that there is something perhaps more important or equally important, which is that I live here, or that I've been living here for quite a while. I come and go, but essentially I spend a lot of my time here.
And why is that important, more important?
It is important because as researchers, if you go into a country and you spend a short time there and you're going in a very targeted way to do research on a very particular thing, you miss a lot of the other things that are going on because you're so fixated on this one thing you want to understand.
And everything is connected in a way, one way or another.
Yeah, so I have done that. But I also live here and I interact with people not in a research context, in a social context. And I hear things, I see things, and I think that has, to a very large extent, strengthened or deepened my understanding of even the things that I discovered as a researcher, which I think is important. And there are times when I have told friends with whom I've been debating Rwanda that they would never understand a country if they don't live there, or if they don't go there enough to see beyond the things they read about.
That is very interesting, because as an academic, as a researcher, you rarely go to live in places on which you write and which you're going to, and that goes for all researchers. So it is then true to say that perhaps the best researcher will tell you, will make it clear to us, the readers of their work, that this is limited, and it may not necessarily reflect the country. So we'll come back to that a little bit later, I think.
Yeah, so now going back to your question regarding at what point Rwanda attains real independence, I would agree with you, but also I would add that until today, until this particular meeting, I have sometimes paused and thought, when people talk of liberation, what do they mean? Liberation from what? Or liberation of what or whom? Because sometimes I say, well, there are people in this country who would still be sympathetic towards the old establishment or what you call the genocidal clique. Would those feel they were liberated if the liberation is really about being freed from that clique? But today you mentioned something important, which is that Rwanda in 1994 gets liberated from this creature or this thing that the colonialists had set up and put in place because that's what they wanted to have in place. Now that deepens my understanding and somehow answers some of the questions I sometimes have about this whole notion of liberation. Because if we put it that way, then it means that whether somebody is sympathetic to the current government or to the past government, still they were all liberated from that stronghold that they lived under. And I was just having this conversation with some friends over lunch, and we were debating whether Rwanda is now free from colonial domination. And they were saying that they are not sure that it is. And I was saying that I think that it is free to a rather larger extent than it was before the genocide. And I gave them the example of the Francophonie conference in La Baule in France in 1989, which is when François Mitterrand told President Habyarimana then that the time for one-party rule had come to an end and he should consider introducing multi-party politics or opening up for multi-party politics. And it was after that conference, actually, that Habyarimana returns here and opens up. And then parties begin to be registered, and we all know where that led.
It's a direction. He was directed to do this.
Yeah, and my point to those friends of mine was that I do not imagine that there is a president in this country of any European of any European country that would issue such instructions to the Rwanda of today.
I mean, I think in a way to that point, which I hadn't considered. I deliberately chose my words when I say independence begins in 1994. Because it is a beginning, it is a process. And I think that part of the constant, almost really hurrying of Rwanda and the Rwandan leadership is that struggle for independence. I think it continues.
Yeah, precisely. I always, in my quiet moments, I usually puzzle about why Rwanda is of such interest to so many people and so many governments, and why it seems that there are people out there who are so committed to this idea of undermining what happens here, criticizing it, overly scrutinizing it, dismissing things that we who live here would see as great advances and minimizing them. And I always think, I always ask myself, what drives these people? And I think that there is a sense in which they're not happy with what has happened here. They are not happy with what they see happening here. And those with the mindset to want to control and to dominate, I think that there is a sense in which they see Rwanda walking away from them and them not being able to exert that control, and that must frustrate. And that
possibly setting a precedent, maybe.
Absolutely. And again, I will refer to the lunch that I just came from. Somebody asked me, what do you think other Africans think of present-day Rwanda and President Kagame? And I said, I actually think that the people in Africa who really look at Rwanda with a certain degree of admiration would be Francophone Africans. Because to some extent they want to be like Rwanda. Because Rwanda has freed itself from that stronghold that France had on it before the genocide. And they want to do the same, and they don't know how to do it. So for them, Rwanda represents something to which they aspire. Yeah, and therefore, in that sense, yes, Rwanda is a bad example. For those who would like to continue to control Africa, to dominate it, Rwanda's impulse to free itself, to make its own decisions and chart its own future is really a danger signal. That this is what the rest of Africa could be like in the coming years. And so in that sense, yes, it's a big threat.
The targeting of Rwanda, again, I choose my words carefully because it is the targeting rather than the criticism of Rwanda. I rather like the idea of criticism. It suggests judgment and suggests a dispassionate look at something. This is not what Rwanda gets. Rwanda is targeted. Rwanda is harried. I think it is it's a separate question, I think, for another time, because the why of it would be really rather important. Because essentially, you can't, Rwanda is doing pretty much all the things that on paper the powerful nations of the West say they would like to see. And yet they're unhappy with that. And often happier with those countries in Africa that aren't doing that. So, but as I say, it's a very, I think it's a standalone discussion that would be very interesting to explore. Yeah. But let me go back to your interesting point on who is liberated in Rwanda. You can expand on this a little bit, but from the RPF political philosophy and from the RPF political perspective, it is all of Rwandans that liberated. All of Rwanda that is liberated. I think they'll consider it a failure if even those who are their opponent feel in any way not liberated. So you're right that there must be people who still hanker back to the genocidal establishment. I do call it the genocidal establishment because that's what it was. And possibly because of power, material gain and so on, but in the sense of being in a country where they want their children to grow up and be educated and so on, I suspect they too feel that they are liberated if they look at it nationally. I don't know whether that's a sense that you get.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at it from that perspective, definitely, I would think that even those people who may not necessarily be big fans of the current government would still feel liberated if they looked at things from that perspective. That today they live in an African country that to a large extent is able to make its own decisions and to determine its own trajectory, or at least to make an effort to do so. It's no longer a country presided over by a political elite who are always waiting for instructions, who act after being prompted by outsiders to do those things that are not necessarily in their interest or in the interest of their country, but which are in the interests of those foreign, what can I call it, foreign patrons. I think that from that perspective, I would agree that they would look at themselves as having been freed from that. But let me also tell you something else, that somebody who I knew for a long time as a civil servant, and with whom I had so many conversations, told me, and this was immediately after he retired from the civil service. Now, this gentleman had been in Rwanda before the genocide. He had been a member of one of the parties that had been registered in 1989, which was eventually banned because it was implicated in the planning and execution of the genocide against the Tutsi. So for a while, he was in the civil service, but a fairly unhappy person because there was something about the new setup that he didn't like. And I think we may have had a series of conversations totaling up to about 8. Periodically, they were not systematically organized, but every time I had a chance to find him, I would find him and we would have these wide-ranging conversations about Rwanda. Now, after he retired, just before he left Kigali to go back to his village in the northwest, we had coffee, and his outlook on Rwanda had completely changed. Because I asked him where he was going to spend his retirement, and he said, I'm going back to my village. I asked him why he would go back to the village and not stay in Kigali. And he said to me, you see, there is now a lot of reasons why I would want to go back to the village, because my village has begun to prosper. the trading center has grown, there is electricity, there is water, new businesses have opened up. So there is a lot of opportunity that I can exploit with my retirement benefits and do something with myself back in that village. And then he said in French, in referring to President Kagame, he said, you know, we shall regret his retirement. He has really been good for this country. And then I said, but are you the same person I'm listening to, who I've always been talking to, and you've been rather critical? And he said, no, you see, the people who are leading this country were actually many of them from my home area. And for many years they used to scare us about what would happen if the RPF, or even more precisely, the Tutsis took over power in this country, and we were in that mindset of being scared of what would happen to us. And then he said, but you see, those people never gave us electricity. They never gave us piped water. And it is these people that they were scaring us about that eventually came and gave us electricity. And now my area is booming because of that. And he said, how can I not recognize that? Now that conversation has stayed with me all these years. And I think that for somebody like that, he really represents a person who might have been of a very different mindset pre-94 and maybe a few years after. And then over time, based on his own personal experience, based on his own observation, he changes gradually and begins to feel, yeah, something fundamental has happened.
You're developing very interesting themes, and it's tempting to follow them, but we haven't got time to do that, so you're going to have to try and do it another time. Just very quickly, in a way, it suggests for a lot of people, it is, what have you done for me lately, is much more important than anything else. But what they tend to forget is that what have you done for me lately is based on a political philosophy. And of course, the IPF-led government, and we should specify that it's an IPF-led government rather than an IPF government, because of course they never govern by themselves, has at its center this idea of being people-centered. So, and the other thing I want to explore with you is that for the IPF and for the people in Rwanda, it isn't so much loyalty or disloyalty, liking or disliking a government. It is more loyalty or disloyalty, liking or disliking a political philosophy. So the government is really almost, it's important of course, but it is built upon this. And I want to suggest that in a lot of African countries, that disappears very quickly if it ever was created in the first place, or it never is. So we have a government rather than a government based on, rooted in some political philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things that I keep thinking about in relation to Africa and how we Africans position ourselves or are positioned in the world is, how do we come to a point where even political change does not destabilize society? And again, I like citing certain countries that intrigue me in that respect. China being one, Israel being another, Singapore being another. And I always say that China has been ruled by this one political party for a very long time. China has changes of leadership, but something remains the same. It remains on the same trajectory, at least since 1978. But regardless of leaders coming and going, the country is steadily on the same trajectory. Now, when you look at Israel, Israel has a very fractious political system. There's a great deal of fighting. So many governments are short-lived. So between Likud and the Labour Party, they are almost always constantly at war. Since almost the founding of Israel, But this has not stopped Israel from being on a certain trajectory and staying there. Israel is a great country, a country of innovation. It's a country of inventiveness, creativity, and so on. And the puzzle for me is, how do they manage to do this? That the politicians can be fighting among themselves, but the foundation remains, and the country continues on its trajectory. Same thing with Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew spent 30 years in power. He left, and people feared things may not be the same after he has gone. He's been gone quite a long time. His son succeeded him. Somebody has now succeeded his son, or is about to do so. But Singapore still remains steady. And I think that what we see there is something fundamental, that there is a philosophy, or there are certain values that are preserved in spite of whatever might be going on at the political level. There are certain fundamentals that it would seem to me as if the political elite are keen to preserve them. They are keen to follow them. They are keen to maintain those things that are turning their countries into great nations. When you come back to Africa with our obsession with competitive politics, every time we have a change of government, almost everything changes. I was telling a friend of mine that in my own country, Uganda, every time we have elections, it takes us 2 to 3 years to recover from elections. Just recovering from elections. And I say, but how can we be creative? How can we innovate? How can we overcome poverty if every 5 years we go back to this same cycle? Because we spend all our time thinking about politics. Politicians are thinking about how they win the next elections or how they increase their chances of winning. So yes, and I think that I don't know what I should call it, whether it's a philosophy, whether it's national values. There is something fundamental that seems to explain the continuity in some countries in spite of what's happening at the political level, and also to explain why whenever there is political change in Africa, everything seems to collapse, and then we have to build afresh.
Well, using your examples, let me try and suggest what it might be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and bring us back to what the IPF is trying to do, or has tried to do, which is that you mentioned 3 countries. One can also mention the Netherlands. One can mention Germany. There is competing political interests, political vested interests. Part of it is historically that didn't help them a great deal, but over time, as it matured, they all agreed on the fundamentals of what they must have. So even though things do change, if you have, say, Britain can be another one. I mean, the next elections, when the likelihood, everybody suggests that the Labour Party is going to get into power, a lot of things are going to change. But there are certain things that are going to remain fundamentally the same. But that only comes after a long period of wars, a long period of all of these things. You can then afford to have this chopping and changing. In a way, you need a period of stabilization. They've had a period of stabilization. Israel is a bit of an exception because it's not as old, but what it has going for it is this strong idea that it's a Jewish state, so everybody agrees on that. So in a way, that's what connects it to Germany, Netherlands, and so on. The IPF, it seems to me, it certainly has a problem when after liberation. These are things that people have thought about before liberation. They didn't just decide to come and say, oh, look, we've got this problem here. But they've been thinking about it. The problem is this, and it's a broadly African problem. You have got this state, which, as I suggested earlier, is really a creature of the colonialist power, of the colonial powers. And you cannot go back to the way things were practically. There are some things you're going to have to live with, some things you're going to have to accept. So the RPF does something interesting, it seems to me. They say, we will root ourselves in what we are, which is what we were, but try and take the best out of what we find. So they look worldwide and they look at what there is. So it's a combination, it's a way of trying to get to that historical stability as quickly as possible. This is how I seem to see it. Now, the way that the political parties are arranged, organized, is to build that stability. This is what seems to me.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that if you think of the notion of never again, which is very much at the center of the RPF's ambitions or the ambitions of the post-genocide government, we can choose to look at that as meaning never again should there be a genocide. But I think that it's wider than that.
Yes.
It's about never again allowing conditions to emerge that led to the genocide. Now, what conditions led to the genocide? I think that the main condition would have been the factionalization of society, the very deliberate division of society and the fomenting of conflict by the state and state agents of the state. And I think that by the post-genocide government being shaped in a way that is inclusive, that minimizes the chances of those conflicts re-emerging, that gives a chance to all those that would aspire to have power to actually have a taste of power by being included in the government as it is, in spite of the RPF being as dominant as it is, and in spite of the possibility that it could have gone it alone if they had chosen to. It would have been possible for them to go it alone, but I contend that it would have been very risky, because it would have probably not very quickly, but over time, it would have incubated those same conditions that led to the genocide. So by creating an inclusive system where they open the way for those who aspire to lead to also come in and contribute ideas, the RPF has set a foundation on which long-term stability can be built. But also more importantly, I think that the RPF has acted as a very responsible political organization, in that it has sought not to impose its ideas on the others, but to convince them that its ideas are meaningful and they are of some value. And I look at Rwanda today and think of things like zero tolerance to corruption. I think of things like Ndi Munyarwanda, where social whatever identity is de-emphasized and Rwandanness is emphasized as being part of values creation. That the period during which the RPF is going to be in power is going to be the leading party. The period during which the RPF is going to work with the other political organizations is going to be a period of learning for those political organizations, so that one can project in the future when the RPF may no longer be in power, when, say, the Social Democratic Party takes power, or the Liberal Party, or whichever other party, in that even at that time, zero tolerance to corruption will remain a major aspiration for whoever is in power. Rwandanness will remain something to be treasured. And I think that that's how you create what I was saying, the fundamentals, whereby leaders change, parties in power change, but there are things that all Rwandans agree about as good things that must be preserved and which therefore they are prepared to protect.
There is a lot of things arise in as you explain that. Going back slightly, one of the mistakes I think that tends to be made in Africa by African academics and African researchers and so on. And I am aware that who am I to be calling it a mistake, but I do think that it is. It is and I know I'm being impertinent and presumptuous, but I do think that it is a mistake. They tend to look at Western nations now and say, and compare them to Africa now. It is historical illiteracy, because if you look at a lot of Western nations historically, I mean, the violence, the chopping and changing of government, the chopping up of heads, and all of this was really the norm until people politically changed their political philosophy and got to the stability that they have. Now you have a long period of, in a way, arrested development as soon as the colonialist powers come into Africa. Africa cannot and does not develop organically. Something stops and something new is imposed upon it. And then there is putative independence, but structures don't change. And people in Africa have no idea what they were politically, socially, in a way, before this thing was imposed upon them. I want to suggest that what's interesting within Rwanda is that the thinkers and the leadership within the IPF understood that. And they said, there has to be a way of dealing with that. And what they have looked for, the IPF didn't take power. We want to use power for development of a nation. They're not, that's what the difference I was making between a political philosophy and a government. A government wants power. Most governments want power, and they are short-lived. The IPF wants a political philosophy, wants a development of a national value-based system that has a relationship to what Rwanda used to be before this thing was imposed upon it. But obviously you cannot go back completely to that. So find a way of reconciling this thing with Rwandanness in a way as any country would do if it hadn't had the colonial system. But we have had the colonial system. So this seems to me is what's happening.
Yeah, I think that is what is happening. And as you said, we Africans, I think that to a very large extent, we are politically illiterate, and we are not very conscious of world history, or we might have even gone to school and learnt about how revolutions in Western Europe happened, how monarchies were overthrown and all that. But I think we don't think so deeply about what the underlying conditions were. What were people turning against? What were they aspiring to? So we almost want to be like those people without having had the historical experience that they had. And we are so unwilling to use our own history and take it seriously.
Or unable.
And use it as the beginning of thinking about what it is that we need to do to free ourselves and to create systems, whether it's political or economic systems, that work for us, that we understand. And again here, Rwanda has been very educative to me in that the RPF seems to have decided, and also to convince what they call their political partners, who are the other 10 political parties, that it's actually a good thing and it's possible to take the best from the things that we have learned academically, the things that we want to copy from foreign contexts, take the best of those that we think can work for us, reject those that we think are not applicable or are dangerous, and then combine those with the best that we can still excavate from our past, and combine those together and build something that might be unusual, that might be difficult for others to understand or even to accept, but which ultimately works for Rwanda, and that's what really counts.
Which, by the way, is using the basis on which Western nations developed.
Absolutely.
They look at around the world and Europeanize what it is that they like and leave alone what they don't like. Somehow we don't seem to have cottoned on to that on the African continent.
Yeah, we haven't, but also significantly, Rwanda being one of those countries that have decided to go that way becomes such a threat, becomes such a target for attack. The other country which may not be doing exactly what Rwanda is doing, but which has the will to be self-determining, which has the will to go it alone if necessary, is Eritrea. And Eritrea is also under constant attack. And it has been under Western sanctions for 30 years. They have worked very hard to try and topple the government there. They have failed. And I think that much as I would accept that there are challenges in Eritrea, which people could use and justifiably so to attack the government, I think that we shouldn't separate that from what is happening from outside. Because all this pressure that has been exerted on the government does shape its behavior. It shapes the way it looks at itself. It shapes the way it manages society. So I think that there are things in Eritrea that happen in spite of the instincts of the people who lead Eritrea, because they're dealing with a very extraordinary situation. But the important thing for me is that Eritrea's rejection of aid, for instance, it really does seem to offend people who give us aid. It's as if Eritrea should accept aid. It should have no choice in the matter whether to accept it or not. And I think that what Eritrea and Rwanda teach me, and what Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi also taught me, is that Africans who seem to want to determine how their countries are governed or how their societies evolve become threatening to the rest of the world, to those who would want to teach Africans how to lead their lives. And I look at the government here, I look at the leadership here, and I always think these people have really had to put up with so much pressure for the last 30 years. And I marvel at their ability to withstand that pressure and continue regardless.
Again, the Eritrea and Ethiopia and so on are very interesting themes which resist the temptation to go there. But it brings me to an interesting question and a delicate question, because a lot of African countries too, I think, because they take their cue, and I'm going to make a bold statement here which will annoy an awful lot of people, but they take their cue from the colonial structures, colonial thinking, become violently angry when one mentions that there is something that they can learn from Rwanda. So I wanted to look, and it is also important to mention, maybe because they understand that, the Rwandan leadership has always been very clear. Look, our responsibilities are in Rwanda, and if others want to cooperate, we're very happy to do that. But they have always really not wanted to get dragged into this idea that they're somehow it's African leadership position. So they have said we are concentrating on Rwanda as it is. Now, but if you are a thinking African, what, in your view, should one be looking at as far as the political system goes? And let's leave the development aside for the moment, because it's self-evident. Things in Rwanda are successful, and but for the shortage of resources, they would be really exactly as what one wants them. But let's look at the politics that underlies all of that. I always think everybody goes on about the economy, which is extremely important. But the most important thing is the politics. If you don't have the politics determines how you drive that economy, how you use the economic proceeds and so on. So it's always the politics. So let's look at that. And what is it that other African countries who, I contend, yet to begin the kind of independence journey that Rwanda has begun and that Eritrea has begun to a lot of ways, what could they be learning from what is happening in Rwanda?
I think what they should be learning is to be introspective and think of what the politics they have chosen implies for their own stability, for the well-being of their own people, or for the chances of their countries to prosper. Because there are things that we need to accept, even without much debate, that no country can prosper without stability and peace. Peace and stability are really fundamental prerequisites for development. No country can develop or be creative or have leaders who spend their time trying to think of how to resolve intractable problems amidst divisions, constant quarrels, wars, and upheavals of one kind or another. I think that what has happened here is that the choice this country made after the genocide to say we are not going to go the route of competitive adversarial politics where you have so many political parties contesting for power, working against each other rather than working together, was really an inspired choice. In that what it has done is it has cushioned Rwanda from those pressures that arise out of the political elite always constantly being driven by this single question: how do we grab power? And when they have grabbed it, as it were, how to keep it. Now, that politics breeds instability. That politics divides society. That politics disillusions sections of society. That politics makes it impossible for politicians to introspect. It makes it impossible for politicians to be creative. But even worse, and this always reminds me of a discussion I had with a colleague of mine with whom I worked for many years here in Rwanda and in Uganda, David Booth, who now retired. We were sitting at one of the Kigali hotels when we got into a discussion about Uganda. And this was after Uganda went back to multi-party politics. And David said to me, you see, one of the risks with this return to multi-party politics is that it's going to breed corruption. And I thought, how does that happen? And I didn't really understand his argument at the time. And now, almost 20 years since, I can see it. Because what we have in Uganda are politicians who, the minute they win elections, they are looking for money to finance the next election.
Absolutely.
Now, if you look at how MPs are compromised in Parliament simply by being bribed directly with 5 million shillings, if you look at what has been happening in Parliament in terms of the amounts of money the Speaker has been spending, and then you see that some people are not outraged. They actually think this is a very smart thing to do, because the Speaker, using this money that has been diverted, has been able to compromise opposition politicians so that they no longer give the government trouble. Absolutely. It's now a shrewdness to be admired, rather than something to be outraged about, rather than something to say we shouldn't have this here. So I think that what other countries should be trying to learn, or what they should get interested in, is how Rwanda has been able to survive all this. And I think that Rwanda has survived this not by miracle, as some people would put it, but by proactive thinking. The leading party here, the RPF, came to power with certain ideas. And from my understanding, they've been able to sell those to other parties and say, you know, guys, we are better off working together rather than working against each other.
Now that is why I want to come in and suggest to you that you're talking about the kind of politics that leads to what is really rather sad consequences in a lot of African countries. I want to suggest to you that it's a lack of the politics, which is where I began earlier, that the IPF looked at the situation as it is and devised a political philosophy. And I'm suggesting that a lot of Africa hasn't done that. And so you simply have governments, and governments simply are there to grab power, for the sake of power. So in a way, the IPF would not be able to achieve, because of the nature of the people in the IPF leadership, because they genuinely desire to improve people's life chances, there would be some successes. But without that underpinning political philosophy, there would not be the channel, the route through which to do it. So I'm trying to suggest that, and what the IPF did was, again, if I go back to what I suggested earlier, was look at the imposition of the colonial structures on what was, and they try to understand how it is that you can then regain, in a way, the nation that was, without having to go back completely because it's impractical. I'm suggesting that African countries have not done that. So they're still existing within the colonial structures. They don't have a political philosophy that deals with that. So they end up with governments, and governments are there simply to grab power.
Yeah, that is true. And as I said, what prevents that from happening? What prevents that from happening is the very easy acceptance that what we were offered at independence, which was political competition, and sort of, in some cases, if you look at former British colonies, the Westminster system, we took it and embraced it without thinking enough about its the implications of adopting it root
and branch. And in a way, actually, even that wording, offered independence, given independence, that's problematic in itself. You don't get given independence. You don't get offered independence. If the colonial power is going to give you independence, they're inevitably going to give you what they want to be your kind, the kind of independence that they want, which is not independence at all. So again, that isn't something that that in Africa we have not confronted, which the IPF has confronted and is confronting. I think I want to keep making the point that it's a process. But let me, we keep talking about this idea of consensual politics is hugely derided in the West. They want to push this idea that Rwanda is a one-party state. Had that recently in the House of Lords when they were debating the Rwanda UK migration agreement. And they don't want to look at this system. So let's define that system. What is the consensual political system in Rwanda, and on what is it based?
I'm a bit reluctant to call it consensual, because when you say consensual, it forces you to fit it within a certain theoretical framework again, and which I think the system here doesn't emulate necessarily. I prefer to call it consensus building. It's a system that is based on consensus building, which means that it's a system where ideas are discussed, and they can be discussed for as long as possible in order to ensure that the greatest number of the political organizations in the country, or even all of them, are on board before those ideas get adopted. Now, that explains something that people usually ask me when they say, is there an opposition in Rwanda? Some even say, is there a strong opposition in Rwanda? And I always tell them that no, there isn't. And then for them, the minute you say no, there isn't, and then, you see,
You can have no
how can you have democracy in a country where there is no strong opposition? And then I have to labor to explain to them that actually the absence of opposition has everything to do with how the system works, how ideas are generated, how they are debated, how they become policy, and that is a very inclusive process. So that by the time something becomes policy, every party agrees with it. So what's there to oppose? And that explains why there is no opposition.
Okay, so hold that thought at the moment. Don't go away from it. I want to introduce something else because, in a sense, the IPF is obliging us to rethink the language that we use. Because when people say, is there strong opposition, what do they actually mean? They mean the Westminster system. Yeah. Now, within the Westminster system, that actually makes sense. And it is organic, it's developed in that. Yeah. But again, what the IPF has done is, in a way, rather paradoxically, precisely what the Western nations have done, which is, let's look at ourselves, let's look at our history, let's look at our culture, let's look at what we need, and develop a political system that suits us. And the conclusion of that was certainly not the Westminster adversarial system. So when people say, is there strong opposition in Rwanda, we are back at that, what I mentioned, which is we don't have a political philosophy in a lot of African countries. Yeah. We're just simply imposing this.
Yeah, they say that with a model in mind.
Yeah.
And if that model is not there in Rwanda, then there is a problem in Rwanda. Now, I would like to clarify something, or try to refine something. I think that what forced the RPF and eventually all the parties that are working together today to come to that idea was a question: how do they prevent the re-emergence of conditions that led to the genocide? Now, one of those conditions was the constant bickering among political parties. So if you get rid of that, then at least you have blocked the re-emergence of at least one of the preconditions. And you don't block that by suppressing other parties. You block it by bringing them into the tent and saying, okay, guys, here is a country, Rwanda, which we all say we want to see prosper. Here is a country that we all love, and we want to see that it doesn't get destroyed as it almost was in 1994. How do we ensure this?
So, I was talking about the changing of language. Instead of, does Rwanda have opposition, perhaps the question is, does Rwanda have mechanisms through which different ideas can be expressed and developed?
I think that's the question that should be asked. But as you pointed out earlier, we Africans have not been taught to think that way. We have been taught to think in terms of models. And the model we were left with was government opposition. Now, if you look at our parliaments, government sits on one side and opposition sits on the other side. Now, when you come to the parliament in Rwanda, it's free seating. So there's no such thing as government and opposition. And when I have been talking to parliamentarians here and trying to understand from them how parliament works, how do they hold ministers to account, for instance, how do they debate issues, I have been told that actually issues in parliament here are debated on the basis of individual understanding of feelings about the issue that's being discussed. There are no party whips that whip their members into adopting certain preconceived positions or pre-agreed positions within those parties. So an issue comes up in parliament, every member contributes as an individual. It's free thinking. And I think that, I wouldn't remember the article, but I think that in the Rwandan constitution, there is an article that protects members of parliament from punishment or from suffering any consequences as a result of whatever it is that they might have said
in Parliament. Let's go to that free thinking.
Yeah, no, but if you could just wait a little bit. So what we have there is, can I call it original thinking? The government here, including all its constituent parties, has dared to be original in conceiving a system that they think is going to make their country go in the direction they want it to go, and that is going to lead to the transformation of their country in the way that they want it transformed. Now, a very senior RPF official, in trying to explain to me in the past about how this system came about, said to me that there was a meeting of all the existing parties at that time. It may have been 1994, 1995. And the question that they were all trying to answer in that meeting was, what do you guys want to do? Say, if you're party X, what is it you want to do for Rwanda or in Rwanda? So every party would state what its aspirations are. And then it turned out that they all wanted to do the same things, or at least their broad aspirations were very similar. And then the question arose, so if we all want to do the same things, why can't we do them together? Or why shouldn't we do them together? Why do we need to fight among ourselves in order to create a peaceful country? Why do we need to fight among ourselves in order to create a prosperous country? Why do we need to fight among ourselves in order to build a functioning health system? Or why do we need to be fighting in order to create a functioning education system? If we all agree that there is a certain Rwanda X, and I think that in Kinyarwanda the words used Rwanda Twifuza, why can't we do that? Why can't we do it together? And I think that this again is where other African countries fail, the political elites in other African countries fail. They don't pause to ask themselves, what do we in our different groups want to do to or for this country?
I was getting ahead of myself, because actually the question I was going to put to you was going towards that, which is original thought, free thinking, in the sense that the Western political systems, because they are organic, because they're not imposed from outside, are also a process. Mature as most of them are, they are still a process. So let me suggest that within Rwanda, people discuss these things, and if 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, they decide that maybe Parliament should be working in this and that way, that too will become part of the political system. Naturally, that's how nations develop political systems and governance. So again, paradoxically, ironically, Rwanda is doing precisely, is being targeted and hurried, as I mentioned, for developing in precisely the same ways as the Western nations developed or are developing or are.
Yeah. And I think that there is a certain feeling, I would think, among certain circles, that Rwanda is being a little presumptuous. Rwanda wants to treat itself as somehow special. I think that there is a little question that nags people who have this kind of attitude. Who do the Rwandans think they are?
Why can they not be just like everyone
else? Why
else?
can they be like someone else? And I have several anecdotes pointing to this. When I was still working at Makerere University, a journalist from a major Western publication came to my office to interview me about Rwanda. He was in Uganda, and he was coming to Rwanda next. And I don't remember who told him that he would have to talk to me, or it would be good for him to talk to me before coming to Rwanda in order to understand the context a bit. So he came and we spent some time talking. And then I don't remember exactly what triggered the comment, but as he was gathering his papers, putting them in his bag, he said, these Rwandans are so full of themselves, someone needs to prick their balloon. And I thought, gosh, what makes him feel that way? But I think that sums up why, that sums up why some journalists come here and file certain kinds of reports. And one that really fascinates me always, something that journalists keep saying about Rwanda, and I first heard it in 2012. And it was said by a journalist who was here, who came and interviewed Frank Habineza, the leader of the Green Party. And that journalist was from Channel 4 News. And he made this statement: Rwanda is increasingly authoritarian. And I remember I was in Manchester, I was at the University of Manchester at the time, and I remember asking myself, increasing from what point? Like, when did it become authoritarian, and how can one determine how? And why is it increasing? How and why is it increasing? And since then, I've had this phrase repeated over and over again, almost every year. Rwanda is becoming increasingly authoritarian. And you think, if it was increasingly authoritarian in 2012, and this is 2024, where has it got?
Yes, on a trajectory towards authoritarianism. There are siren voices. Here are the dangers now. There are siren voices you hear. In order for Rwanda to gain favor with the Western nations, the most powerful nations in the world, Rwanda should do this. Maybe Rwanda should do that. Maybe Rwanda should do the other. And these are often done genuinely. If Rwanda does this, maybe people will be a little bit nicer to Rwanda. There seems to be there seems to be an opinion in Africa, or almost a conviction in Africa, that it is important to behave yourself so that the Western nations are happy. Is there a danger that Rwanda may be tempted to, after all, everybody likes to be liked, Rwanda may be tempted to say, all right, then let's tweak here so that you might like us?
That's a tricky one. Let me start my answer this way, that I think, and this is confirmed by many of my Rwandan friends and my Rwandan interlocutors who I speak to, whatever the circumstances, that there is a sense in which today's Rwanda reflects President Kagame's personality in many ways. If Rwanda is defiant, then President Kagame is a defiant individual. He doesn't toe the line. He doesn't feel he owes anyone any explanation for whatever he's doing. And by anyone, I mean outsiders. I mean, he talks constantly about Rwandans accounting to themselves. So he sees himself as there to account to Rwandans, not to anyone else. Now, the question you're asking, and me, the way I ask myself this is, if a lot of what we see reflects his personality, once he's gone, and that personality is not there to project itself on the country or on the decision making, what are we going to see? If we get a lead after him who is quite happy to play along with whoever is trying to lecture him, who is not as firm in their belief in Rwanda's right to autonomy and independence and to self-determination, are we going to see that change? I think there is a possibility. But at the same time, I would like to think that President Kagame's period in power, as I said, that the RPF's hold on power has been a chance for other parties to learn from the RPF and to internalize some of the things that the RPF has put in place and make them their own as well.
And also the building of consensus.
Yeah, I would like to think that the people that President Kagame has been working with all these years, especially those who I consider to be the next generation of leaders in this country would have learnt some things from the way he does his work, from the way he does his business, and that they would like to emulate that and continue with that because it has worked.
I want to suggest that, I mean, I know the man as a public figure, so I cannot speak to him about him personally. So my understanding from a distance and what he does and what he says. But I want to suggest that his leadership is his influence, his strength, his power is a moral power rather than the other kind of power, which is, he will say, he reflects the values of Rwanda because he lives them. It gives him the moral authority to be able to say, well, look, we say this is who we are. It gives him the moral authority to say to the IPF Secretariat and say, we said this is what we're going to do. This is what we stand for. This is what we're supposed to do. And as long as he lives that, it gives him almost unassailable moral power. And so the question then really for me becomes that to what extent is the institution, and one of the things that have been that are being attempted to do, I keep going back to the point that this is a process that are being attempted, is the rooting of institutions and processes. To what extent can we say that people have understood what he's trying to do, what he's trying to show them, and not fixate on the personality and the character and so on. It's the old Buddhist idea of, you pointing at the moon and people look at the finger rather than the actual moon. To what extent are Rwandans going to be looking at the moon rather than just being hypnotized by the finger?
My understanding is that a great deal of Rwandans would still think that he as an individual makes a great deal of difference, and that he and his ways, maybe his beliefs, are a very important explanation for how this country runs.
That is inevitable.
But have people learnt from him? I think they have, and I've spoken to a fairly good number of the younger generation, the 30-something, 40-something, including those who would have been in the Liberation War as teenagers, who are now middle-aged, who are now...
And have they taken his thinking, his way of thinking, and owned it, separate from him as an individual, as a person? Because listen to a lot of his speeches, a lot of his addresses. That is what he's trying to get people to do. Yes. And then people go away saying, "Oh, he said something wonderful. Isn't he wonderful?" Yeah. And the question I'm trying to get at really is, to what extent do they now understand that he's trying to give them something to take the ball and run with it, rather than constantly look up at him and say, "Oh, isn't it wonderful?"
I would argue that they have learnt. And I've had some very specific conversations with people who have told me exactly under what circumstances he taught them what. And it's always interesting to listen to these people who, as young 20-something-year-olds or people in their early 30s, there are incidents when certain things happened where they got to learn something very important from him. They have been watching him. I think that they have learned how he does things. And I think that the will or the drive on their part is to take that forward. But let's not forget, there are two things that I think we need to take seriously. One is that, for instance, this country is not going to have another Kagame. We can't clone him. If you talk to people who were in the war with him, who worked very closely with him, they will tell you he has been very consistent. Now others will go even further and say his consistency is almost not human. That what he was telling them during the war is what he continues to emphasize. The wrongdoing for which they were punished during the war, he will still do the same thing today. So there is a sense in which that is very difficult to emulate. Now that is one. So even people who have learned from him, they may never have that, the closest word that I could, or term that I could use is, it's a favorite Greek phrase, somebody having iron in the soul. They will never be like him. They may never attain that consistency, but the fact that they have seen things that he does, admired them, and feel that these things are important, they would love to emulate them. Will they be able to do it consistently? We don't know. We will see when we get there. The second thing I wanted to point out is that President Kagame and his generation are driven. We shouldn't underestimate the personal experiences they had. First, of being forced out of this country, those who were children in the late 1950s, early 1960s, being forced out, and them as children not quite understanding why they had to leave their country. And then there is the refugee experience, when they live for 30 years outside their country as refugees or as second-class citizens, when they had to struggle for those things that citizens took for granted, and therefore the drive for them to regain their country and be in a place where they feel they are in charge, they are valued like everyone else, where they feel this is home. That's going to be very difficult to replicate or to reproduce among the new generation who were born here, who were born in exile, who never had the other experience. But I think that the RPF, being the organization it is, or at least as I understand it, this is a values-driven organization, and I have had a chance to look at some of their documented values, and the RPF being very bent on emphasizing those values, and as you said, he goes to the RPF and reminds them of certain things all the time. Chances are a great deal of this is going to be maintained. What will change exactly and how it will change, I think we need to be patient and wait.
Well, I mean, as we come towards the end, I just want to mention two or three things. In a sense, there is no doubt any fair judge who, with average intelligence, would conclude that this is a singular individual with singular talents. I mean, I would say, I would put my head on the block and say that he is the most one of the most remarkable political leaders globally at any stage, which is to me always the absurdity of the comments that you get about him from outside. It just misses so much. For some deliberately, but for others just simply piggyback onto that. But you see, all of those talents that you mentioned, I would suggest and I would imagine, and from listening to what he says, looking at what he has done, again, he's not that interested in people focusing on this. He's interested in saying, well, thank you very much, but here's a political philosophy, and here are the structures that would lead us to where we are. I've done it the way I've done it, but I want to understand that you grasp it, that it is now yours. So in other words, translate it in the way that you do it. We can both run 100 meters, but you're not going to run it the way I run it, and I'm not going to run it the way you run it, but we'll both run 100 meters and get there. Yeah. So what I really want to understand, 30 years on, is to what extent the Rwandans beginning to not say we looking only at you, but we're looking at what you see, and we see it, and we're going to make it our own.
I think I should refer you to speeches that he has been making of recent concerning the party not being yet ready to let him go, and him urging the party and Rwandans generally to now begin to look beyond him. Because their argument for retaining him has everything to do with not being sure that if he's not there, things will continue the way they are going and the way they've been going in the past. Now, I think that he has been trying to calm down those jitters. Now, the extent to which we as Rwandans or members of the RPF have embraced that and plucked up the courage to face it squarely in the face, I'm not sure. I think I think it's necessary. Yeah. Have people reached there? I don't think they have. Should they reach there? I think they should. And I think that it's going to take a lot of deliberate pushing and priming and preparing for them now to reach a point where they say, okay, now we feel confident that even if he's not there, we will be fine.
There are two things there. First of all, I actually think it's perfectly sensible, and it would be rather odd if it wasn't the way it was. If you got someone clearly as remarkable as that in the position of leadership, and he is willing to, offer himself as a candidate, you keep electing him. Well, this makes sense.
He hasn't always been willing.
Sure, this is true, but essentially, I think that the philosophy...
I think he accepts the idea. Sure, he accepts the idea that Rwandans feel a bit nervous about him leaving.
Well, I just wonder whether it's. I do understand this idea of nervousness and jittery, and it is there. I think you're right that it is there, but it is, by the way, sensible. And if you look, you're on a ship, and if you've got a captain who is, brilliant at, taking you into safe waters. Why are you going to change the captain if you don't need to? So there is that logic. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are not prepared to understand that there may be a time when you have to have another captain. But for as long as you can have that captain, it makes no sense for you to say, well, let's have another captain. Well, why would you?
Yeah, I think you would begin to think that you need to have another captain once you begin to take seriously the current captain's expressed desire to move on and to allow you to move on also. And I think that, and I feel it all the time among my friends, I feel it among my my in-laws, because we have these conversations all the time. I think that there is a recognition that inevitably change will have to come.
Sure.
The issue is for people to accept that this change should come sooner rather than later.
Are we to some extent over-dramatizing this? Because again, looking at it through a Western lens, because really, I will give you an example. The Germans felt something similar with the departure of Angela Merkel, and it is a natural thing to feel, which does not necessarily mean that when the time comes, when you have to find another captain to push the analogy, you're not going to be perfectly sanguine about doing it.
I agree, but I would like to think also that Angela Merkel must have prepared her people by having decided eventually, after 15 years. I'm sure along the 15-year period there might have been periods when she thought maybe it's time to leave, and then she stays on a bit longer. Then she thinks maybe I should go, and then she stays on a bit longer. And then there came a time when she said, no, this is it. And I think at that point she may have started preparing people around her to say, look, this is it. whether you like it or not, you really now have to prepare.
Right.
And I think that that time is going to come definitely when President Kagame does that. And who knows, maybe he's already doing it. And, when time comes for him to go, it will just be a clean switch from him to someone else.
Okay, that's a discussion that, again, one can continue. Let's end on this, if we may. Rwanda does not live in a vacuum. It's part of the world. It would be, we've decided, it would be disastrous if Rwanda decided to listen to the siren voices and say, let's do things in a way that the Western powers will applaud. In other words, because, one of the only, I would suggest actually, reason that it succeed is precisely because it has said, this is who we are, what do we need, how do we do it, what is the best for us. You change that and everything changes. But as I say, Rwanda doesn't live in a vacuum, it's part of the world. So what should it do to ensure that it doesn't continue to be a target? It doesn't, I'm sure the leadership would like a bit of peace and quiet, to be allowed to get on with things. Sometimes one wonders whether it's been too much of a distraction. So what should they do? What can they do, if anything? Or is it just simply, steady as you go?
In my 24 years in this country, I have learned something important about Rwandans and their leadership. And I think that the instinct is one of non-capitulation. The instinct is of saying, this is our country. We have ideas about where we want to take it, and the responsibility for taking it there is ours. Other people can come and help us, but ultimately it's us. In addition to that, coming from the history of the genocide against the Tutsi and the way the international community reacted to all that, there is a feeling that in the end, if we don't do it ourselves, no one will do it for us. And so I would think that prioritizing getting peace or getting some kind of respite from these attacks would amount to capitulation and ceding the responsibility for Rwanda's evolution, the responsibility for Rwanda's projection forward to outsiders again. And I think that really is anathema to the RPF and to many of its political partners in this country, and to many Rwandans, younger than the Kagame generation, but especially his generation. Because I speak to a lot of Rwandans, the 30-something-year-olds, the 40-something-year-olds. Those would be the younger generation. And I think that this idea is so deeply ingrained, that this is our country, and the best thing is for us to make the decision about where we want it to go. It's so deeply ingrained that if those who attack Rwanda are determined to continue attacking it, I think they will attack it for a very long time to come. And if you asked me what my preference is, I think I would prefer that they tighten their belts, the Rwandans, continue what they're doing for their country. I think that there will come a time when outsiders realize that there is something quite fundamentally good happening in Rwanda. And again, I will tell you that in my 24 years here, there is a time when I used to tell fellow Africans outside Rwanda that there is something quite significant happening in Rwanda, and we ignore it by focusing on opposition and human rights and so on. And that thing is of Africans taking their fate in their own hands. And in spite of all the challenges, and no one can claim that Rwanda is perfect, that there is nothing wrong here. No, there are things here that shouldn't happen. There are many challenges. And again, a senior RPF official once told me that, if you come to Rwanda looking for things that don't work, you will find them. There are so many. If you come to find things that work, there are so many. So in the last 24 years, I have seen attitudes begin to change. And I think that just by force of character, Rwanda has forced people who were inclined to be dismissive or to attack it 24 years ago now to take a second look. And increasingly I hear people saying, yeah, what is happening in Rwanda, what is happening in Rwanda is something we need to pay attention to. President Mbeki was quoted in a South African newspaper a few days ago. I don't know if the headline reflects what he said, but the headline said, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but he was suggesting that South Africa is backsliding and Rwanda represents what needs to happen or what should happen. And I think that's
to avoid backsliding.
Yeah, that sums up how increasing numbers of people are beginning to see Rwanda and to look beyond the cosmetics of, are there human rights violations? Are people being arrested? Are there opposition parties? Those are cosmetics. I think that beneath the cosmetics, there are really quite deeply fundamental things happening, which other people should look at, possibly emulate if they can.
We're on not capitulating and on looking at learning from best practice. Dr. Golooba-Mutebi, thank you very much indeed for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
Cheers. Well, there's a lot more we could have covered, but perhaps we can try it again another time.
It will be my pleasure to come back.
Thank you very much indeed.